All right, today we are diving into one of the most complex and, let's be honest, controversial parts of American democracy, the U.S. Electoral College. It's a system that's built around a pretty wild central idea.
It all boils down to this one, kind of mind-bending question. I mean, it seems to fly in the face of the whole one person, one vote idea, right? And yet, it is the fundamental reality of how the United States chooses its president. So, how on earth is that even possible?
And look, this isn't just some academic puzzle. It has actually happened 5 different times in American history. As you can see right here, the person who got fewer individual votes from the people actually became president in 1824, 1876, 1888, and then, get this, twice in just the last few decades, in 2000 and again in 2016. So to really get why this happens, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
You have to understand, the Electoral College wasn't some accident or an oversight. It was a very deliberate design, an 18th century solution for what the framers of the Constitution saw as an 18th century problem. They had a really specific idea of how this should all work.
And this quote from Alexander Hamilton, it just nails the original thinking. The idea was that the immediate election shouldn't be in the hands of the general public. No. It should be made by a select group of what they considered to be the most capable men who could really analyze the candidates and make a wise choice.
Okay, so here's the really crucial thing to get. The framers were actually pretty skeptical of direct democracy. They were worried about what they called tumult and disorder. Basically, they feared that some charismatic but maybe dangerous leader could whip up the public and get elected. So they designed the Electoral College to act as a kind of buffer. A system where these elite, informed electors would filter the will of the people, all while trying to balance the power between the states and the new federal government.
But, fast forward to today, and, well, that original vision of wise, independent electors making their own choices, it's pretty much gone. The system today runs on a completely different set of rules. So, let's break down how it actually works now.
First number you need to know, 538. That's the grand total. It's the total number of electoral votes that are up for grabs in any presidential election.
And here is the second, the magic number, 270. To win the whole thing, a candidate has to get to 270. It's the finish line, a simple majority of 538.
So, how do we slice up that pie of 538 votes? Well, the formula is actually pretty simple. It's based on a state's representation in Congress. You take a state's number of members in the House of Representatives, you add its 2 senators, and boom, that's its number of electoral votes. It's also why every single state is guaranteed to have at least 3.
Now, this right here is probably the single most important rule in the whole game. In 48 out of 50 states, plus DC, it is a winner-take-all system. Think about that. If a candidate wins a state's popular vote, even by one single ballot, they get all of that state's electoral votes. Only 2 states do it differently, Maine and Nebraska, where they can actually split their votes.
And what does this winner-take-all system create? Well, it creates the whole phenomenon of swing states. Because most states are pretty reliably Republican or Democratic, we call them safe states, the campaigns pour almost all of their time, money, and attention into just a handful of competitive states, where the outcome isn't a sure thing. Winning those states becomes the entire strategy.
So what happens when a system like this gets tested? When it's pushed right to the edge? Well, that's when you get some of the most dramatic, most controversial moments in all of American political history.
And you don't have to look any further than the year 2000. The entire presidency, the leader of the free world, came down to the results in just one state, Florida. And the margin between George W. Bush and Al Gore was an unbelievable 537 votes. That tiny margin kicked off a massive recount and, well, a political firestorm.
And a huge part of the chaos came down to this thing, the infamous butterfly ballot. The design was just confusing. The candidates' names were on both the left and right sides, but the punch holes were all down a single column in the middle. It was incredibly easy for a voter to accidentally punch the hole for the wrong person, which threw thousands and thousands of votes into question.
And that led to this surreal scene where election officials were literally holding individual paper ballots up to the light, trying to figure out voter intent. A new term entered our vocabulary, the dimpled Chad. For weeks, the whole country was debating whether a tiny indentation on a piece of paper, a dimple where the hole wasn't fully punched, should count as a vote. It was just a symbol of how chaotic the whole thing had become.
In the end, it all went to the Supreme Court. In the landmark case Bush versus Gore, the court made a huge decision. Basically, they said, look,
Every county is using a different standard to recount these votes, and that's not fair. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And with that ruling, they effectively stopped the recount, which awarded Florida's electoral votes and the presidency to George W. Bush.
Okay, so the 2000 election showed us just how messy counting the votes can be. But what if the problem isn't the count? What if the problem is the people who do the final voting? What if the electors themselves just decide to ignore the voters and go rogue?
Yeah, there's a name for this. A faithless elector. It's someone who's pledged to a candidate but decides to vote for someone else. Now, it's pretty rare, but it's always raised these big constitutional questions. Well, just recently, in 2020, the Supreme Court finally settled it in a case called Schiaffallo versus Washington. They ruled unanimously that, yes, states absolutely have the power to pass laws that force their electors to vote for the candidate who won the state's popular vote.
So with all these controversies and these big discrepancies between the popular vote and the electoral vote, you can probably guess that there's a huge ongoing push to reform or maybe even get rid of the Electoral College altogether.
And when you talk about reform, it really boils down to two main ideas, two different paths. The first is trying to change how it all works without actually amending the Constitution. And the second path is about reforming the existing federal process through acts of Congress.
So let's look at that first path. This chart shows you the progress of something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or NPVIC. And you can see right here that states with a combined 209 electoral votes have already signed on. They're about 77% of the way to their goal.
So how does this thing work? It's actually pretty clever. States that join this compact agree to give all their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. But here's the catch. The whole deal only kicks in once enough states have joined to reach that magic number of 270 electoral votes. Now, critics of this plan worry that it would just make candidates focus on big cities and ignore smaller, rural states even more than they already feel they are today.
Okay, now for that other track, a federal fix. Congress recently passed this law, the Electoral Count Reform Act. Now, this isn't trying to create a national popular vote. It's more like a tune-up for the existing machinery. It makes it crystal clear that the vice president's role in counting the votes is just ceremonial. It makes it much harder for members of Congress to object to a state's results, and it tries to prevent the chaos of having competing slates of electors sent to Washington.
And all of this brings us right back to the central question, doesn't it? We have this 18th century system, designed by people who are genuinely afraid of direct democracy, and it's operating in a 21st century country that, for the most part, really embraces that idea. So the big question we're all left with is, does this system still serve its purpose, or is it finally time to change the rules of the game? That's the debate that's still shaping American democracy today.